Hey guys, in today's video I will show you how I stole the art of Golden Demon winner Magnus Nielsen, and I'll tell you why you should do the same if you want to get better at painting minis. A few weeks ago I saw this fantastic paint job of Grandmaster Ezreal by Magnus Nielsen on Instagram, and I was like, man, I would really like to paint like that. So I saved the picture for future reference, but the thought just kept bugging me. I had that model in its box in my drawer so I could try, but now that I saw the high bar Magnus set, could I paint it well enough for my own liking, or will it be a disappointment? So I decided to turn it into a learning experience. I would do what proper artists call a style study. Instead of painting in my own style, I would try to copy what Magnus had done as best as I can. And I don't mean just the colors. I would try to imitate his style completely so I can later incorporate what I have learned into my own approach to mini painting. So basically I would take that one picture I had of the piece and try to deduce as much as I can about how it was done, and more importantly why he chose to do it the way he did. I'm not sure if Magnus shared any details about how he did it, but I intentionally avoided looking. I love guides, but once in a while I find that I can learn more by just trying to imitate something without any idea how it was done. The question I needed to answer was, what makes Magnus' style tick? What tricks does he use to make his paint jobs look so good? And full disclosure, this whole project is an attempt to copy the Ezreal paint job from Magnus Nielsen. The original paint job was his, and all the credit for the awesome scheme goes to him. He did it first and he did it better, so check out his stuff on Instagram. His paint jobs are out of this world. I will link it in the description below. But if you want to see how I achieved my version in detail, as usual there will be PDF guides on my Patreon, and I will upload the whole process in a video format there as well. There are a ton of PDFs and videos there already, so check it out and sign up if you like what you see. Alright, we have our work cut out for us, so let's see what we can learn from this little experiment. First of all, I needed to build a model, and this time I decided to keep it in sub-assemblies, because if I wanted to get close to the original, I felt that I needed to go all out. But immediately I had to figure out two problems. First, the box only had one of the little watchers in the dark, the one holding the scabbard of the sword, and Magnus used two of them in this project. Fortunately for me, I had the big Dark Angels box set, and I remember that I saw some of these guys in there when I built my Dark Angel Terminators. And the dude with the smoking sensor was right there on the Terminator sprue, so one problem was solved. Magnus used a custom banner instead of the one from the box, and I think his works better for the overall composition, but I like the details of the original, so I decided to stick with that one on mine. The other issue was a little bit more complicated. The base Magnus used was really cool and it added a lot to the overall effect, but it was not the one that comes in the Ezreal box either. I'm not sure if he built it himself or he used the base from some other kit, but I had nothing similar, so the only choice I had was to build one myself. First of all, I 3D printed a plinth that would fit the base and the models. Nothing fancy, just a simple circular design I found somewhere. I might do a video about how you can use FDM printers for stuff like this at some point. It can really be handy when you want to do something custom like this. Then I decided to use some air dry clay for the stairs. I have never used this material before, but I was experimenting here anyway, so this was as good a time as any to try out new stuff. Also, doing this with green stuff or milliput would have been quite expensive. Turns out that this stinks quite a bit, but it's super easy to shape, much more so than milliput or green stuff. So I made a flat pancake-like shape that covered most of the base, leaving only a crescent shape in the front. Then, using some basic modeling tools, I sculpted the steps out of this by making grooves in between them. With this done, I made another smaller pancake that I placed on top of it to create the second layer. And I continued carving out the steps with the sharp tool and then smoothing out the edges with the silicone one, while I was also shaping the overall layout a little. I went back and forth doing this until I was happy with how it looked. Then I sculpted a couple of random looking rocks and something resembling a column, and I attached them to the steps more or less in the same positions as the ones on the original. I made some adjustments while the clay was still soft and pliable, and I also added two plastic skulls, fixing them in place with super glue. Then I covered the crescent shaped ground I left open using some terrain paste, and now I only needed to let the clay dry for a couple of days while I was painting the model. In the end, it's not as nice as the one Magnus used, but for something I made in less than an hour, it's pretty close, I think. Alright, this was the easy part. Now it was time to figure out what he did with the actual paint job, starting with the green armor. So looking at the armor, a couple of things jumped out to me immediately. The most obvious one is that instead of the more traditional Dark Angels green colors, he went with a more mint green color scheme. And he didn't use any obvious colored shadows. The armor appears to be a simple smooth transition from dark to very bright green, and yet it looks very saturated. If I did this with my own approach, I would have probably done a red shadow, green midtones and yellowish highlights, and quite a bit of scratches and imperfections on the armor to mask the transitions. So this was already quite different from how I do things. Which is good since I wanted to learn new approaches, I guess. So to start with, I painted everything with black purple. I refuse to believe that Magnus started from black, and since there will be a lot of purple on this piece overall, I decided that this would be my shadow color. Then I started to highlight up with a green color that I felt will get me a similar shade to the one we see in the original. I did this very gradually, first adding the green to the original dark purple in the shadows, then using the green pure in the midtones, and for the highlights I added more and more white to the green. But using paints with white instead of yellow for the highlight mixes meant that I was losing color, and the original was quite saturated, so I solved this by using a green ink, carefully glazing it into the midtones. This helped restore the colors and also gave me a little crutch for smoothing out the transitions. And this smoothing out the armor the way Magnus did it was the biggest challenge for me. The highlight placement was pretty much what I would have done anyway, but I usually don't bother too much to do perfect transitions and use little tricks to hide the imperfections, which saves me a lot of time. But here I spent way more time than usual going back and forth with the highlights, glazing with the ink and some of the mixes on my wet palettes. I even went back and did more smoothing when everything was painted and before the model was assembled. In the end, I didn't get the perfect finish that the original had, but I made it much smoother than usual, which was a learning experience in general. Here you can see the head fully painted next to the partially painted body. The colors always look better in context in my experience. Okay, so the green armor was very different from how I would have done it usually, but nothing extraordinary. I spent more time crafting the transitions and I used an ink to maintain the saturation despite using white instead of yellow in the highlights. So far so good, let's do the purple robes next. And this is the point when I started to realize a pattern in how Magnus was doing things. If you look at the robes on the Watchers, you get the feeling that they are a little rough and frayed, and that is especially obvious next to the smooth armor. He achieves this by using some subtle textures on the robes, nothing flashy, just some little scratches and implied texture, especially at the edges. The other important thing is the color choice. The whole piece uses two main colors, green and purple, with red, white and gold as the accent colors. But as you will see, there is some purple hidden in basically everything, unifying the piece and giving it a slightly gloomy atmosphere. Now after the smooth, cool colors of the armor, I had to paint some warm purple tones with even warmer highlights. So instead of white, I created my lines by adding more and more yellow into the magenta as I was increasing the brightness and reducing the area I was covering. And instead of using smooth brush strokes, I used little scratches for the highlights. This is not exactly how Magnus did it, but this is very much in my ballpark of painting, so I decided to do the assignment in my own way. After all, I didn't need to make an identical copy, I just needed to understand the thinking process and learn from it. So I achieved the texturing in my own way, but the end result was still quite close to what I needed. But once again, I spent more time on this than I usually would, adding more glazes with a contrast paint to smooth things out and to maintain saturation, and in general doing scratches slower and more deliberately. I usually try to fit my projects in a 10-hour time window so it's easier to work with the footage for the video, but the time limit means that sometimes I don't spend enough time on refining things. This project took me almost exactly 24 hours to complete instead of the usual 8-10, and I think it shows. Alright, so now I have the smooth green armor painted with mostly cool colors and some warm and slightly textured purple robes. What's next? If it wasn't obvious from the previous step, Magnus really likes playing with contrasting textures. So the white outer robes are also quite textured, but in a very different way and to a different degree compared to the inner ones. These ones seem to have a stippled surface to differentiate them not only from the armor, but also from the other textile materials on the model. And even though they are essentially white, they also have a lot of the main colors on them, quite a bit of purple and a little bit of green as well. I started with the light violet undertone because I wanted to end up with something close to white, so I couldn't start very dark since textile materials tend to not have too much contrast, and the violet undertone helps me sneak in the usual purple atmosphere. Then I simply used the large and then consecutively smaller, old, slightly frayed brush, and I stippled in the highlights, making more dots where I wanted the lights more solid and making them sparser where I needed a transition. When I was happy with one layer of marks, I used a glaze of the same color to smooth things out a little and to integrate the texture into the surrounding area. The highlight placement was once again fairly standard. I painted the top of the folds, but also the valleys in between them where the light would reach them, and I left the sides of the folds darker. The magic was not in the placement of the highlights, but the technique they were applied with, the tones that were used, and how the whole thing created contrast with other elements around it. And when I was done with the highlights, I glazed in some purple tones and even a tiny bit of green here and there to integrate the robe with the overall atmosphere. Once again, the result is not exactly the same as the one on Magnus's model, but it follows the spirit of it, I think. And he's a much better painter than I am, so I guess I should be happy if I can get even close. Nice, so now I have the three very different looking materials on the model and it looks pretty good, but there is the next problem. Now I have to make plenty of whitish looking things in addition to the robes, and they need to be all very different from each other. First I took care of the purity seals and the scroll on the pauldron. These were pretty straightforward to do. I simply used different tones of bone colors on them to differentiate them from the robes, and I made them relatively smooth without any textures and with warmer midtones. The feather hanging next to them on the little shield I made slightly whiter and added a little purple glaze on it. Towards the end I will add some freehand script on the seals and the scroll to make them even more distinct, but for now they are good enough. The white decorations are a little more tricky to do. The idea here is to make these quite smooth, cold and very bright with lots of close to pure white colors, unlike the other whitish things which look more textured and are slightly warmer. So I built these up from blue-gray colors going up to full white in some places, but the trick here is in the details and in creating highlights without a lot of contrast. I spent a lot of time reinforcing the separation lines between individual elements like the feathers on the chest while I was painting the highlights. It's very easy to make this part either too messy by not having any separation or by adding too much contrast and losing the feeling of a white surface. So this needs patience, a good set of magnifying glasses and quite a bit of brush control. The end result is not perfect and I could have probably spent more time on this part, but the details are quite sharp, it reads as white and it looks quite distinct from all the other whitish things on the model, so objective mostly achieved. Okay, with all the white stuff done, let's do something a little bit more colorful and paint some red. And the red Magnus used on this is actually quite close to how I would go about painting red, so this was a little closer to home for me. The main thing here was to go for extreme saturation and make a very striking and strong red. I kicked things off with a purple undertone to create an interesting colorful shadow and also to sneak that all-important purple tone in here as well. As I mentioned before, the purple is basically everywhere on this piece, hiding in the shadows. After that, the only thing to do was to build up the highlights from dark purplish red in the shadows to pure red in the midtones and orangish colors in the highlights, especially on the most valid edges. On the wings of the helmet, it was actually a very similar exercise to what I did with the white wings on the chest. I needed to maintain separation between the individual feathers with dark lines while building up the highlights from purple to orange. But it was also very important to not only highlight the individual feathers from their base to the tip, but also the whole wing. If you watch carefully, you can see that each feather has its own transition, but the wing as a whole is also getting brighter towards the top. I achieved this by making the highlights bigger and bigger on the feathers the higher they went. With the red done, now would be the time to talk about all the non-metallic metal elements, but to be honest, these were done in a pretty standard way, and so I will only say a few things about them here before I move on to the sword and the base, and you can check the Patreon guides for more details if you're interested. The gold was done with the gold non-metallic metal paint set from IONIC I recently bought and I really wanted to try, and this was the perfect time to do it. I went from a dark purple, which is probably not a surprise at this point, through ochre and yellow tones all the way up to white. And the most important thing I had to consider was to observe the overall lighting direction, which is coming from the top and slightly from above the left shoulder of the model, which is the same way I usually do it as well, so that was easy. There are not a lot of gold elements here, but the warm yellow gold is still a very important accent color in the scheme, so once again I put more effort into this than usual, and in accordance with Magnus's style, I made it smoother than I usually would by putting more effort into the smoothing steps. But the steel is a bit trickier, since here I made some changes compared to the original. The one Magnus did is darker and lacks the bluish tones I used. It's a darker purplish tone instead, which is more in line with the overall purple tone of the piece. But I kinda like my bluish version as well. The fact that it stands out more from the surrounding elements is both a plus and a minus, I think, and I'm still not sure if I should have copied the original or not. But be that as it may, it's still a mistake because I failed to adopt the style of Magnus that I wanted to use and I fell back to my usual way of doing things. Oh well, at least I noticed it when I reviewed the footage and I learned from it. Alright, let's talk about 3 more important things before I can assemble the whole thing and call it finished. And those are the sword, the smoke coming out from the sensor, and the base. The sword is very important. People tend to pay attention to weapons almost as much as to faces on models, and this one is in a very prominent position, held aloft in a salute or maybe a challenge. And looking at Magnus's version, we can notice a couple of things. It has a very high contrast with large dark areas and very bright highlights. But the highlights are bigger and brighter on the edge facing the light, and they are also parallel to the ground instead of being parallel with the hilt like most people paint them. And finally, it has not only really nice purple tones in the shadows, but also quite unique yellowish green ones in the highlights. And as usual with Magnus, it's darn smooth, so I had to do a lot of glazing to get even close. I used the same colors I also used on the rest of the steel elements, that is why mine also has some bluish tones on top of the purples and the greens. I marked all the highlights and painted all the edges, and as I was highlighting up, I spent a lot of time going back and forth with glazes of the same color, smoothing out the transitions. I made sure to make the highlights parallel to the ground as Magnus did by doing diagonal lines at the borders of the transitions. Then I softened these into the main highlight with glazes. Finally, I took one of my favorite paints, laser yellow, and thinned it down to a very thin glaze. I painted this in between the midtones and the highlights, adding the green-yellow tone we see on the original and using it to smooth things out even more. This wasn't a straightforward process though. I went back and forth using glazes of previous colors and then laser yellow again to integrate the yellow-green properly. Not only does this make the blade look much more interesting, but it also makes it look like the green of the armor and maybe the environment is reflecting on the blade. Now before I talk about the base, let's look at the smoke a little because it's more important than it might seem. If I did this myself, I might have glossed over this bit since it doesn't seem like the most important thing at first glance, but it's actually in a very prominent position in the foreground and it's quite big as well. So I immediately noticed that Magnus put quite a bit of effort making it look interesting, so that is what I did too. First of all, I made a big transition from an almost pure black at the tip of the smoke to a white at the source and purple in the middle. Notice that once again we are using purple tones. I'm not super good with composition myself, but I'm pretty sure Magnus was using a triangle of purple things with the ropes and the smoke forming the bottom and the flag the tip. With the transition mostly done, I glazed a little blue into the midtones. This actually reinforced in me that the bluish tint in the steel was also a good idea. Then I used some laser yellow again to tint the inner parts of the smoke near the source slightly greenish. Now we managed to sneak in not only the purple but the green as well. And finally I used this very saturated purple color to make it look like the inside of the smoke is glowing a little. The end result looks quite striking, and it is a good example of how good painters can add more details even on seemingly insignificant elements. Speaking of insignificant elements, people, myself included, tend to not put a lot of effort into bases, but here the custom built base is actually quite important to the overall composition, and Magnus made it look spectacular. It is using very similar colors to the overall piece, so purples and greens, and once again we are back to textures. The stone steps have quite obvious textured surfaces that contrast nicely with all the other finishes on the models. So as usual, I started from dark purple tones on both the ground and on the rock, since if you look carefully you might notice that the ground is also a shade of purple on the original and not just your typical brown. Then I did some overbrushing with some dark green-gray colors, making sure to keep the crevices and the deeper parts in the dark purple. And from this point on, the trick was to make all the highlights using irregular lines drawn with a large brush using brighter and brighter greenish-gray colors. I made them sparser on the middle parts, but I added more on the outer edges, and when I was happy with the amount of lines, I thinned down the same mix and dragged it from the middle of the steps towards the outer edge so they would cover over the areas with the thickest scratches and integrate the texture into the previous color. Finally, I airbrushed some more colors into the shadows and the midtones of the stone to make it more interesting and also to smooth things out a little. I went with the usual purple and green colors mostly, but I also added a little reddish brown to sneak in some warmth, since I felt that I was using too many cold colors which didn't fit the environment I wanted. And of course the base wouldn't be complete without a hint of laser yellow next to the highlights, which tied things together even more and made the highlights look even brighter. Now I just needed to add a couple of grass tufts which add even more green to the base and paint the skulls, and the base was finished. At this point I even took the time to go back and make some corrections to the individual parts of the models before assembling them and fixing them on the base. I usually skip this step because I'm lazy and hasty and want to move on to the next project, but here I spent about 2 hours doing it, which is at least 2 hours more than usual, so that is a win. Finally, I assembled everything the way I saw it on the original, with the little guy with the sensor on the left on the bottom steps, Ezreal on the top in the middle, and the Watcher with the scabbard immediately behind him. And the end result after 24 hours of work looks like this. If you put the two pieces next to each other, I actually think that I managed to do a pretty good job. Magnus's version is clearly better, but I think mine is not too shabby either, and more importantly, I got a lot of insights into how he does it, which now I can incorporate into my own painting. So let's summarize what we have learned. The most obvious thing for me is that he creates a lot of contrast with subtle textures. By using different finishes on all the main surfaces, he makes it very easy for the observer to distinguish between different materials and elements on the model, which is very pleasing to the eye. He also uses a lot of subtle tricks with colors very consciously, working the main ones into the whole piece in a way that feels quite natural and creates a very specific atmosphere that ties everything together. And finally, he's way more technical than I am. Everything seems way more crisp and clear and smooth, with a lot of care and detail even on elements that I might dismiss as not so important. So the lesson here is to put in the time that is necessary and don't rush things. I'm pretty sure that I have missed a lot of little things and only managed to deduce less than half of the thought process behind his decisions, but this already helped me become a better painter. And this is probably the closest I will ever get to having an original Magnus Nilsson piece on my shelf, and that already makes it worth the effort. I hope you guys also found it useful, and if you did, go out there, find a painter you like and try to copy one of their projects as close as you can. I guarantee you will learn a lot doing it. And if you liked the video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and maybe dropped a comment under it as well. It really helps with the algorithm showing it to other people. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible, and this is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.